All right. Hello, everybody. In this video, hopefully relatively short, what I want to talk about is quotes and how we use quotes. This is, again, part of my attempt to go back, cover all of our bases, and make sure everybody's on the same page. So when it comes to quotes, the first question is, what role do quotes play in an essay, right? So obviously they take up some space, so they help us reach our word count or our page limit, but they are also evidence. So hopefully that was kind of the first thing that came to your mind is, hey, they provide evidence. The harder question is, how do we use quotes effectively, right? If they are evidence, what's the most effective way to use evidence? So the way that I like to think about quotes is very similar to the way I like to think about conclusions, which is to think about it kind of like a court case. So if I had a court case and I said, that person is the murderer, here's the murder weapon, that those two things are claims, but I haven't yet tied them together. I haven't explained the connection, right? And a lawyer wouldn't just say, here's the evidence and walk away. They make sure that they can explain it. And that's what we're going to kind of unpack. So quotes are evidence. It's a way of kind of saying that we're right. So think of it, again, like a court case. If my claim is Paul cheated on the last test, and I have three pieces of evidence, let's just decide logically, as kind of we've looked at in this class as well, whether or not it makes sense that Paul cheated on the test. Again, without a admission from Paul or a witness, we just have to go on the evidence that we have. So the first piece of evidence is, I heard Paul say after the test, I can't believe I got away with it. Okay, so that's A. B, I found out that Paul got a perfect score on the test. Okay. And C, Paul has never passed a test in the class. Now, we have to ask ourselves, are we comfortable saying he for sure cheated on this test? And in order to sort of think about it logically, we have to think about whether or not there's another logical explanation. Is the only option that he either cheated or he failed, right? And that seems to be a false binary. There are a lot of different things, right? Maybe after failing every test so far in the class, Paul's finally like, right, I'm going to get to work. And he studied and he went in to get extra help from his instructor and he had a tutor and he took every online practice test and he finally passed the test. And he can't believe that he finally got away with passing a test. He finally succeeded, right? So, again, we have to make sure that all of the information is there. Part of that is making sure that we can explain the connection, what Toolman would call the warrant. What's the connection between my claim and my evidence? So if I claim that Paul cheated on the last test, and my evidence is I heard him say, I can't believe I got away with it, then I might say that because of the sequence of events, we took the test, we walked out the door, the first thing that he said is, I can't believe I got away with it. He wouldn't have known that he had a perfect score yet. So that's maybe when our suspicion started, but that alone isn't enough evidence, right? So let's look at another example. And again, I want to let's think logically here of whether or not, based on the information that we have, again, short of a witness or a signed confession, whether or not we would be comfortable saying that we are 100% certain or 90% certain even that this person is guilty. So let's say that Alex ate all the cookies. All right, that's my claim. And you say, well, how do you know that? That's a pretty bold claim. And I say, well, logically speaking, the first thing I need to establish is, again, that there is a problem that needs to be addressed. And in this case, it would be all the cookies are gone. If all the cookies aren't gone, then our claim cannot be true, right? It could be partially true. He ate a lot of the cookies, but he didn't eat all of them if the cookies are not gone. Now, I also know that Alex loves cookies. So if we kind of start to think about it, okay, things are looking pretty bad for old Alex here, right? Except if I don't have any other evidence, it's hard to say that he did it, right? I need to be able to say, well, he had an opportunity, right? If you watch any sort of crime shows, it's always like motive and opportunity, right? So I found crumbs on his shirt. So that's my other bit. So I've got 3 things here. And if all 3 of these are true, how comfortable am I saying he is for sure guilty, for sure ate all of the cookies? Now, what if I add one more piece of evidence to this? There were still cookies when we all left for work, and Alex is the only person that's been home during that time. Okay. I think at that point, a lot of people would begin to say, yeah, this is looking pretty bad for old Alex. But let's make sure that we've kind of done our due diligence. Let's say that the cookies that are missing were peanut butter cookies, and Alex is allergic to peanut butter. Well, unless he's in anaphylactic shock, then he didn't eat them, right? So we need to make sure that, yes, he loves cookies. He can't resist cookies, and, they're a type of cookie that he could eat. So again, we have to make sure that we've covered all our bases. Whether or not we go into all those details depends. Now, we found crumbs on his shirt. That's pretty damning. But is the crumbs and his love for cookies enough to say that he ate all of them? All right, let's bring ourselves to number 4. There were still cookies when we all left for work, and Alex is the only person that's been home. Okay, that's fair. But what if there's a dog in the house and the dog happened to get into the cookies? Right? We have to make sure that we're covering kind of all of our bases. And although these examples are relatively silly, hopefully it kind of shows you the way in which we need to begin thinking about how we use evidence. So quotes are evidence. We need to make sure that we're providing context for that specific quote. Now, what happens a lot, especially in the news media and on social media, is that people will take a quote out of context, and it will sound like somebody said something they never said. And we've seen this a lot. Every politician gets taken out of context. As writers, what we want to do is make sure that we're saying, here's what's happening around this quote. What I think a lot of people miss is they find a quote, they like the quote in the text, but they fail to read what's on either side, and the quote may not actually mean what they think it means. So once we provide that context, we also need to provide our interpretation and explanation, right? Here's how I see this connects. Again, kind of looking at the Toolman model and thinking about the warrant. We want to think about the importance of the speaker. Who is speaking? If I said, according to Smith, blah, 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 what makes Smith an expert, right? Unless I've already introduced Smith, I want to make sure I take a moment to explain who this person is. And it doesn't have to be a lot. According to cookie psychologist Smith, blah, blah, blah. That gives us enough because now we know that there's credibility. And then, of course, remember that quotes back up our claims, right? So I want to talk about just maybe 2 other things here that I think are helpful in thinking about how practically to use our evidence. Now, the first thing that I would say is it's best to find your evidence first and then create your claims. The analogy that I often use is it's like going to the pantry, right? You say you want to make spaghetti and meatballs for dinner, and you've got your heart set on that, and you go to the pantry, and you have noodles, and you have meatballs, but you don't have any pasta sauce. Well, there are a couple options. You can decide to make something else, right? In this case, write a different essay. You can try and substitute something, right? Like maybe I'm going to use ketchup. Well, it's not going to be the same. It's going to probably be kind of a little bit less than what I was hoping for, which means I'm kind of forcing it. Or I can go to the store, right? Which is kind of going back to the source to find something else. Or I could order from Grubhub, which in this analogy would be cheating, right? It would be plagiarism or ChatGPT. Okay, so how do we use evidence? I also like, because I like analogies. I think analogies are a really good way to rethink things. So I don't know how many of y'all really know the science behind GPS. Now there's true GPS and there's kind of the GPS that's in our phones and things like that. But in general, it works on triangulation. So that's the image here. my location, if I turn on a GPS, a signal goes out to, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 satellites, and it figures out how long it took that signal to bounce out. From there, it's able to figure out my location. So again, when I think about this, in this analogy, if the location is my overall claim, right, like Paul cheated on the test, each piece of evidence is a satellite. Right? Does that make sense? Right. So if I only have one satellite, it's not going to be very accurate, right? And one piece of evidence is not really going to be enough. But there's also a point of oversaturation where I've got too many pieces of evidence or too many satellites, and then it's not really doing me any additional good to have that extra evidence. Okay. So there's a couple analogies for you. Let's look at just something that, again, some students find helpful, which is having an acronym. I personally am not a big fan of these, but if they're helpful to you, please do use them. So the PI structure is not something I came up with. It's been out and around for a while, but the letters stand for point, illustration, explanation. So what I would do is say, what is the point I'm trying to make? Okay, the point is Paul ate all the cookies. What's the illustration of that? He's got cookie crumbs all over his shirt. And then what's the explanation? Well, he would only have cookie crumbs on his shirt if he had eaten the cookies, so the crumbs prove that he ate at least some of the cookies. Now, what I will say is that it's really, really helpful to balance your quotes. In most cases, I would say a good rule of thumb, not a requirement, not a rule, like a concrete rule, but just a good rule of thumb, something to kind of keep in mind, is that your explanation of that evidence, of that illustration, should probably be at least as long, if not longer, than your illustration, right? So let's say you have a quote that is 2 sentences. Your explanation of that quote should be at least 2 sentences, if not more. One of the things that this helps us avoid is big block quotes. So if you're not familiar, a block quote is a really long quote. So imagine you're reading an essay or an article, and all of a sudden, half of that paragraph is a quote, 7, 8, 9 sentences. Well, what happens is, first of all, most readers are inclined to skip those long quotes. I don't know what it is, just psychologically. Every class I ask, most people will readily admit they see a long quote, they're skipping it, right? So we lose out there. Also, what happens, especially in a research essay, is now it's somebody else's work. So the solution in that case is generally to shorten the quote by using context and paraphrasing and summarizing, and then really focusing on the explanation. All right. So there you go. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, jokes, memes, or recipes, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll talk to you all later.